Grace to you and peace from the God who comes to us in the wilderness. I think it's a little ironic that our gospel lesson for today warns against outward displays of piety on the one day of the year that we mark ourselves with a visible cross. Of course, we do this ritual because today is Ash Wednesday. It's the start of the season of Lent. Lent is the span of time between Transfiguration Sunday, which we celebrated last week, and Easter. It is a season of preparation, and it stretches out for 40 days. 40 days because, as we will hear this coming Sunday, that is the amount of time that Jesus journeyed in the wilderness before he began his ministry. And it's appropriate to think of wilderness at the beginning of Lent. After all, the wilderness is an unsettling place, and Lent recalls those times in the Bible when the people of God felt unsettled. It echoes the years that Moses spent wandering in the desert after leaving Egypt, or the weeks that Noah and his family spent adrift on the ark. The wilderness is the backdrop to the formative years that the Israelites spent meandering slowly towards the promised land. And it is to the wilderness that characters like Elijah and Hagar flee when they are threatened. The wilderness is frightening. It's full of wild animals. It has extreme weather. It is a place of scarcity and danger and isolation. Sometimes Lent can feel like that too. The rest of the church year celebrates all the ways in which we are saved by the goodness and grace of God. But as we approach Good Friday, Lent serves to remind us why we needed to be saved in the first place. Like the wilderness, the vocabulary of Lent can leave us feeling unsettled. Lent reminds us that we are sinful, mortal, and in need of mercy. And like the wilderness, these reminders can feel dangerous or isolating. Part of why they might feel that way is that for many of us, the vocabulary of Lent sounds a lot like words that have been used to do great harm. For so many of us, words like sin and contrition and repentance have been spoken to us only by voices that have told us we are not enough. These voices come to us from our society, from our loved ones, from our churches. And if this is the case for you, if for you the language of sin has been used only to abuse and shame and drive you from God, I want you to know that this is not God's intention, and that you are a beloved child of a loving God who did not err in creating you. After all, the misuse of the language of sin by the people of God is just one example of what Jesus warns us against in today's gospel lesson. A few minutes ago, we heard an excerpt from the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, in which he warns against over-the-top displays of piety. Do not pray just to be seen praying, he says, and don't give alms just to receive praise. And if you must fast, don't go around rubbing in other people's faces just how miserable you are. You see, Jesus is concerned with people who think that simply going through the motions of faith is enough to appease God. And just as we shouldn't engage in acts of faith just to show others that we are holy, so we should be careful not to bludgeon our fellow children of God with language that might crush their spirits. Because after all, we are all in need of salvation. We are all in need of God's love. And that's because we are all sinful, but not simply because we occasionally think dirty words when we're driving in traffic or because we snuck an extra dessert from the buffet. To say that we are sinful is to acknowledge that all of us will, at one time or another, find ourselves in the wilderness. It is to recognize that we all live together in a broken and hurting world, that we will all suffer and that we will all one day die. That's the gift of Ash Wednesday. It tells us the truth about who we are. We are created from dust, and to dust we will one day return. Today, as Lent begins, we name this reality because our lives, too, are riddled with scarcity and danger and isolation. We are a people who wander in the wilderness. But the wilderness is also a place of renewal. Because no matter how deeply we go into the wilderness, no matter how far we wander, God is still there, and God will deliver us. On Ash Wednesday, we acknowledge that we are sinful and mortal and in need of mercy, but we do so knowing that this is not the final word for us. It is not. Because the God who comes to us in the midst of our brokenness is a God of hope and love. And on the other end of the Lenten season that we begin tonight, there is a cross and an empty tomb and a promise that we will be renewed. That's why we mark our foreheads with a cross made of ashes tonight. Not so that we can stop on the grocery store on the way home and show off that we came from church. Not even so that we can wallow in our need for sin and repentance. Tonight, we remember that we are claimed by a God who will not leave us lost. After all, it was the breath of God sighed into the dust that gave us life and spirit. All of creation, even the dust from which we are made, comes from God. And it is to God that we return. Amen.